Greetings, welcome to the second presentation in this fifth semester of the Emerald Choral Academy. I am Gary Cannon, Artistic Director of the Emerald Ensemble, a professional choir based in Seattle, and I'm here with our Executive Director, Scott Kovacs, who will moderate tonight. The Emerald Choral Academy is a series of interactive webinars during which our area's leading professional choristers reveal their personal tricks of the trade to community singers. These webinars are then made available freely to singers across the world via YouTube. The Emerald Ensemble acknowledges that we operate on the traditional land of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present. We aim to honor with gratitude the land itself and the life of the Duwamish tribe. This presentation is funded in part by a grant from the Washington State Arts Commission, in addition to the National Endowment for the Arts, for Culture, the Seattle Office of Arts and Culture, and many generous donors, like many of you. We encourage anyone participating or viewing this webinar to make a donation as you are able at emeraldensemble.org. You can also subscribe to our YouTube channel and join our mailing list to hear about future sessions of the Academy and the other activities of the Emerald Ensemble. This webinar is being recorded. By participating, you are granting the Emerald Ensemble permission to share your contribution. Your microphones and cameras will remain off for the duration of the presentation. You can ask questions to the presenter, me, this night, by typing into the chat or Q&A features at the bottom of your screen. And periodically, Scott will interject to field your questions. So as I mentioned, I am tonight's presenter, and we're doing something a little different than we usually do. One of the aspects of the Emerald Choral Academy that we've had so far is that these presentations tend to be very practical based, things on singing technique or practical elements like score markings. And this particular evening, it's evening right now here at least, we're taking a more theoretical approach, as it were. And tonight we're moving toward the realm of musicology and music history. This is a great passion and interest of mine, particularly the music of early 20th century Britain. And that's why I'm here to talk about that. Okay. Let me shift now to a screen sharing. Those of you watching, you will notice that I'm going to be switching back and forth in my screen sharing between my PowerPoint presentation and my iTunes, which has the sound samples. My technology skills, not for the first time, do not live up to, I hope, my musicological new. Oh, wow. And having phrased it like that, now I think I've topped the potential for pretentiousness that I'll have today. Here we go. That's us. That's what we're here for. And I need to raise that up. Okay. This concert, and as we're talking about Vaughan Williams and his music for chamber choir, or that is for smaller chorus, this presentation was inspired in part by a concert that the Emerald Ensemble will hold next month in celebration of Vaughan Williams' 150th birthday, which was just about, let's see, it was 7 days ago. 7 days ago. I can do math as I look at the calendar. This is a particular, so those of you planning on attending that concert next month, you will hear mention of several of the pieces that we have on that repertoire, though we're certainly not limiting my commentary to those pieces. This is a really exciting time to be a fan of the music of Vaughan Williams. As I mentioned, this is a big anniversary year for him. There are performances all across the world of his music, especially in the UK, and also in the US. There have been big anniversary commemorations. But looking back over the last few years, About 20 years or so ago, there developed a renewed interest in Vaughan Williams's little-known works, including student works and early orchestral works, theatrical music as well. And this has brought about a whole series of publications and recordings, especially on two different labels. One is called Dutton. They do a lot of the early orchestral stuff. And the other is Albion Records. That is the label of the Ralph Vaughan Williams Society. All kinds of premieres, art songs, early stuff, theatrical music, shorter choral works. It's really fascinating that the fact that Vaughan Williams is such a prominent composer, and yet we're still finding quite a few works of his that have yet to receive a premiere recording. Exciting times indeed. So I'm going to start out tonight by giving an overview of Vaughan Williams' life. I'll try to make that one brief, and then we'll talk about the works specifically. I tend to group Vaughan Williams' life into three categories. Unsurprisingly, they are early, middle, and late. The fact that he lived so long and that his repertoire, his voice, his compositional voice evolved so smoothly makes classifying things on stylistic grounds very difficult for Vaughan Williams. So I basically group things into before the First World War, between the two wars, and then after the Second World War. It is entirely arbitrary, it's historical, not so much on stylistic grounds. Vaughan Williams was born into a rather wealthy family. His father's side, they were very prominent lawyers, including one especially well-renowned judge. His father was an Anglican minister. His mother was of the Wedgwood family, who made china, as we know, and they were extremely wealthy. One of his relatives, in fact, was a great-uncle Charles Darwin. It's fascinating. Once young Vaughan Williams asked his mother what was with all the controversy about great uncle Charles, and she said that the Bible says that God created the world in 6 days. Uncle Charles just thinks it took longer. Which I thought was a beautiful answer, in part because it allowed him to make up his own mind about things and to really be his own person. That was the case throughout his entire life, and that was established even when he was very young. He began music lessons at age 6, first piano, then violin. Then he took a correspondence course in music theory, very precocious. He attended the Charterhouse School, which is one of the top boarding schools in the UK, like Eton and Harrow. He played in the orchestra there. He even organized a concert of music by himself and a friend. Very precocious there. In 1890, he joined he started studying at the Royal College of Music. Hubert Parry was his teacher. We'll hear more about his relationship with Parry later. Then 2 years later, he went to Cambridge, where he read history. You could say he was a history major. But he also studied and received a Bachelor's of Music degree under Charles Wood. He was studying. And as well, he got his bachelor's in history. Then he went back to the Royal College of Music, where Parry was not available, so he studied with Charles Villiers Stanford. Stanford was notoriously irascible. I think of him as any kind of stereotypical Irish personality. That's Stanford, unfortunately. They didn't get along particularly well. Stanford didn't get along with most of his students, in fact. But Vaughan Williams did learn from him a particular way of looking at his craft. So he underwent quite a lot of study. In fact, in 1901, I didn't write it on the thing here, he finished a doctorate in music at Cambridge. That was a very unusual thing to do. One of his relatives said, "Oh, Rafe, he will go on with his music." A little derisively, she said that perhaps, but it shows that there really wasn't deemed to be a lot of promise in him as a musician, as a composer. He was doing this, his family was wealthy, he was able to do whatever he felt like, essentially. In 1897, he married Adeline Fisher, who became a great support for over 5 decades. and helped him with various musical elements. They honeymooned in Berlin, and on their honeymoon, he took composition lessons from Max Bruch. I don't recommend to any of you that are going on honeymoons, I don't recommend getting composition lessons while you're there. Just saying this, just Vaughan Williams did it. Bruch was one of the arch-conservative German composers, but of incredibly important influence. Most British composers, in fact, had done some training of one sort or another in Germany for a while. But this was all that Vaughan Williams had, was a few lessons with Bruch. He started his career in earnest, not really, the year that I kind of give it was 1902, at which point he was already, what would that make him, 31 years old? I don't see, yeah, 30 years old. That was his first published work. He was a very late bloomer in that sense. The first published work being the song Linden Lee, which is still a great favorite today. And he wrote songs in earnest, quite a lot. Song cycles like the songs of travel and others. That's one of the most famous. Two big noteworthy events in the mid-1900s, the decade of the 1900s. First, as he began collecting folk songs, what that entailed was walking around the English countryside from village to village, and asking the older people that he found to sing a song, any song they remember from their childhood. It turns out that he eventually collected over 800 of these folk songs. He was one of the central figures in this tradition of ethnomusicology in Britain. He also was invited to be the music editor of a new volume called The English Hymnal. This was a big 2-year project wherein he had to choose several hundred hymns to be included in a hymnal that you'd find in the pews of any of the Anglican churches in England. He had a different approach to it, as we'll see a little later, than most hymnals had at the time. He wasn't as interested in some of the Victorian, stodgy tunes, but instead found sources for others. He started writing as well and lecturing around. He wrote for the Grove Dictionary articles on conducting and fugue. He gave lectures around England about folk song and other topics. His first really big premiere was a piece for chorus and orchestra called Toward the Unknown Region, with a text of Walt Whitman. He became very affiliated with Whitman texts, as you'll see. And this was premiered at the Leeds Festival and got quite a lot of review, to the point where Leeds soon after commissioned another even bigger work that I'll mention in a moment. In 1907 and 1908, Vaughan Williams felt that he still had much to learn with his craft. I mentioned that his family was a little derisive to it, to his compositional efforts. And he was aware of his own deficiencies. So he went to Paris for several months and studied with Maurice Ravel, who was 3 years his junior, but a much more prominent figure at the time. Ravel once said that Vaughan Williams was the only one of his students who didn't write his, Ravel's, music. Very different sound between the two. And new works, which we now recognize as masterworks, started churning out from Vaughan Williams. He wrote incidental music for Cambridge University's production in Greek of Aristophanes' The Wasps. The Fantasia on a theme of Thomas Tallis was premiered at the Three Choirs Festival in Gloucester in 1910. It was one of those watershed moments. Quite a lot of people, including composer Herbert Howells, first heard about Vaughan Williams at that occasion. That same year was the next big Leeds Festival piece with another Walt Whitman called A Sea Symphony. It was quite innovative in some respects. It was written at the same time that Mahler was writing his 8th Symphony in Austria, and they were the first two pieces, those two, that were symphonies that involved a chorus throughout the entirety. They were a lot like Beethoven 9 or Mendelssohn's Second or some by Liszt that had a lot of instrumental things and then a choral finale. But these two works were the first that include chorus throughout. The Fantasia on Christmas Carols remains a very popular work. It was the first time that his studies in folk song really bore fruit. He wrote scores for the Shakespeare productions at Stratford-on-Avon. He wrote more for Greek plays of Cambridge. He wrote a London symphony for orchestra. And then the First World War happens. During the war, Vaughan Williams essentially stopped composing entirely. He enlisted as a private. After his basic training, he eventually went to France as essentially an ambulance orderly. He would be one of the people carrying, what do we call them? They were kind of gurneys now, carrying the cloth that would carrying it to the front, to the trenches, loading on the injured and dead soldiers, and carrying them back where the wounds could be tended to. A brave fellow, and certainly the fact that he survived was as fortuitous as any that survived the war. Then he did a similar service in Greece for a while. Then he was recommended he get officer training. He was an artilleryman for a brief period, until in the north of France, he was asked to be the director of music for the First Army. And that entailed him going to the trenches and trying to create choirs and orchestras and bands from soldiers who were fighting at that time. Talk about a tough job. He did it. He had some success with it. And then the war ended. And we enter what I call the middle period of Vaughan Williams' life. He suddenly became very prominent. He started teaching at the Royal College of Music, where he'd been a student. He conducted very frequently all around England, his own works and those of others, most prominently at the Bach Choir in London, which still today is one of the most prominent large amateur choirs in Britain. He edited more. I mentioned the English hymnal before. There were two other volumes called the Songs of Praise, very much like the hymnal, and Oxford Book of Carols, which I'll talk about later in more detail. He lectured all around, including in the US. He came to Philadelphia to lecture at Bryn Mawr in 1932. After the Second War, he lectured for a time at Cornell. And he gave other lectures around England, one of which was famously called "Who Needs the English Composer?" And then he kind of, I think, demonstrated that Britain was creating its great composers after all. In the years right after the war, he kind of collected his thoughts. He brought in some pieces that he was beginning before the war, such as the Lark Ascending for violin and orchestra, and his folk song opera Hugh the Drover, and he finished those up. He also brought in works that were reflective of his war experience. The Pastoral Symphony is the primary example of that, which he said was inspired when he was sitting alone on a hill and heard a bugleman in the far distance. Also, during the period of the war and shortly thereafter, there was a great interest in music, English music of the Renaissance, which bore fruit in the Mass in G minor. Big deal there. We'll talk about that. So he was really, during this time between the wars, the great leader of British classical music. Bit by bit built that reputation. I've listed here a couple of just major works: the Oratorio Sancta Civitas, another opera based on the Merry Wives of Windsor, Sir John in Love, his ballet Job, the Fourth Symphony, which really shook everyone as a surprise because it was so dissonant. He was no longer this pastoral, gentle composer, and it wasn't so much vocal or about a plot to it, like in Job, even though it's orchestral. 36 brought two big choral works with orchestra: the Five Tudor Portraits, which is comic, and the Dona Nobis Pacem, which is introspective and reflects on the difficult political position of the time. Dona Nobis Pacem meaning grant us peace. A lot of Walt Whitman in there as well. He also wrote at this time what I think is his greatest opera. It's a one-act called Riders to the Sea. Highly recommended. Oh, glorious stuff. There were other events in his life beyond music, involving music, I should say, beyond composition. 1931, he conducted Bach's St. Matthew Passion at the Leith Hill Festival. He had been directing the Leith Hill Festival chorus for some years already. It was near where he lived in the county of Surrey, about 20 miles south of London. He conducted the St. Matthew with them almost every year until his death. So over 20 productions of it. He recorded it once too. It's a weird take by modern standings, but it's incredibly musical. I mentioned how incredibly important he was in the realm of collecting English folk songs. You really get this when he becomes president of the English Folk Dance and Song Society, which was founded by Cecil Sharp in the 1890s. When Sharp died, Vaughan Williams was the person they called to go through his papers, the papers for the organization and the papers of folk songs that he had collected. That's just how central Vaughan Williams was to that activity. 1937, big year in Britain, coronation of George VI. Hooray! 1938 was an even bigger year in Vaughan Williams' personal life, where he met a woman named Ursula Wood. They fell in love. And in a few years later, after Adeline died, the two of them married. Their story is really quite beautiful. I'm not going to go into the details of it here. It was unconventional and beautiful kind of love that they had. That was just before the Second World War, during which he wrote a lot of scores for films of kind of quasi-propagandistic mode, mostly. First one was called The 49th Parallel, an important film in British filmography. He also wrote his Fifth Symphony, which went back to this kind of pastoral vein of sorts. It was based in part on music that he had been writing for an opera on the Pilgrim's Progress, the extended work by Bunyan. And at that point, he figured he probably wouldn't live long enough to actually finish the thing. It had gone on for decades, so he worked a lot of it into a symphony. The war did end, and the next symphony also surprised people because of its last movement, especially. It's a very dissonant first three movements, and the last is a desolate, almost wasteland of sound. It's stunning and terrifying, and people were hoping for a triumphal post-war symphony. Instead, they got something very different. He was taking a new approach to the idea of a symphony. New approach to the idea of film scores came in 1948 also, with Scott of the Antarctic. Very important work of film from Britain at the time. Vaughan Williams actually wrote his score before the film was done, so they had to edit quite a few of the takes based on his music. He explored different instrumental sonorities, especially with percussions in that film, and he liked it so much that he reworked it into a symphony, the Sinfonia Antarctica, a few years later. Before then, he finally finished that Pilgrim's Progress opera. It was done at Covent Garden, very prominent in London. The production was terrible and it didn't go well, but it was performed at Cambridge a few years later, where it was received very, very well. Hooray, hooray. 1953, the coronation of the late Queen Elizabeth II. These next few works I list purely as examples of these new sonorities and new approaches that he was going for. A tuba concerto. I've read in one place that claimed this was the first major concerto ever written for the tuba. Vaughan Williams thinking outside the box. He has this big hour-long piece called the Hodie on Christmas, which we'll mention a little bit later. It's on many different texts that center around different aspects of the Christmas story. His final two symphonies, the 8th and 9th, are continue in the vein of looking at instruments in an unusual way, particularly percussion. There's a big saxophone bit as well that was somewhat controversial as being unusual at the time. That's a rough overview of Vaughan Williams' life. You'll notice there was a lot of talk of orchestral pieces and pieces with orchestra, like operas and choral orchestral pieces, concertos. Vaughan Williams did, however, compose in just about every genre you can imagine, including much smaller scales, whether it be little songs or little choral works. And so we're here to talk about his works for the chamber choir. I should pause here and ask Scott if there are any questions as yet. I've been going quickly.
Yeah. Show self. Here we go. No, not yet, Gary. We have anyone. Now's a good chance to put any questions that you might have into the Q&A. I am monitoring both the chat and the Q&A, so if something happens to drop into the chat, I'll be sure to catch it. But otherwise, Gary, I think we're good to go to get into the topic of the night here.
To the meat of it,
The
as
meat of
it
it, as it
were.
said. Yes.
So the Vaughan Williams output for chamber choir, every piece of it fits quite neatly into one of these three categories I've listed as music for the church, music based on folk songs, and music with a literary text. Some pieces kind of bleed in from one to the other, but they all fit into these particular elements. So I'm going to go again through each of those periods in his life and look at the pieces from each of those categories there. I am not including arrangements by other composers, including there's a gorgeous new arrangement of The Lark Ascending for unaccompanied chorus by Paul Drayton. It's just wonderful. And I'm also not including excerpts of bigger works with orchestra, because let's face it, most works for chorus and orchestra you could just perform with piano, and he would have sanctioned that in most cases. Vaughan Williams was very much engaged in allowing his music to be performed by anybody, however that could be done. So let's look quickly at his early stuff. Of those, early in his career, as he was still a student at the RCM and at Cambridge, he wrote quite a lot of rather conservative part songs. Part songs are unaccompanied choral works that are rather short, usually between 3 and 5 minutes or so, on literary texts, or at least poetic texts. One of his best from that era is called Rest, with a text by Christina Rossetti. It was written in the same year that Lyndon Lee was published. I'm going to play a bit of that for you so you can have a sense of what Vaughan Williams, excuse me, what Vaughan Williams' early perception of choral music was like. Now I need to stop sharing and this screen and now go to share this other. Let's see how quickly I can do this change. Wow, that actually worked. All right, here's a bit of Vaughan Williams' Rest. Very nice stuff, quite beautiful, very fluid in its very legato, smooth, pleasant to listen to. Really, but it could have been written by Elgar, Perry, Stanford, any number of British composers of the time. There isn't a real individual fingerprint on it. There are a few other works that start getting more of one. He has a piece called Ring Out Your Bells, which has a kind of bell-like start, which was a little text painting interest. He started then with two Whitman settings. The first was a unison setting, so for unison voices and piano, called Darest Thou Now, O Soul, and then one called By the Bivouac's Fitful Flame, that was based on a string quintet that he had been writing. I want to play a little bit, though, of a work from 1913, just before the First War, called Love is a Sickness. You would be forgiven if you thought that this piece had been written in the late 16th century.
Love is a sickness full of woes, or remedies refusing, a plant that with
There have these absolutely like a Renaissance madrigal. I mentioned that the Renaissance music was starting to get more interest, especially British Renaissance music was starting to be of greater interest in the 1910s. And here you have a sign of just how much it was already being appreciated and studied. These two pieces, by the way, we are going to be doing in next month's concert. So if you like them, come to the show. And so there's a little bit about his literary stuff. It's mostly straightforward or imitative of other styles, though not exclusively. His early music for the church, the first stuff he actually wrote for the church was for the English hymnal, published in 1906. He wrote 4 original tunes and 65 harmonizations. So other tunes that already existed from other hymnals, or in 12 cases at least, they were folk songs that he adapted or put into hymn format. Here's one of the most famous. This is one of his original numbers called Sine Nomine, with the text "For all the saints." Enough of that. Good. So it's a hymn. It's a good old hymn, and it's a great one. In fact, if we were all in person here, I would ask a show of hands of how many of you have heard that tune. It has become one of the standards in both Protestant and Catholic worship these days. In 1911, he wrote the 5 mystical songs on text by George Herbert, who was one of the, as it was called, metaphysical poets of several centuries earlier. And they're originally with orchestra. They're very often done with just piano. I've conducted them with piano only. And they're excellent and full of aspects of text painting, similar to what we saw. I mentioned the bell sounds in one of his earlier works. You'll hear specific mention of something in a text. He'll depict it in the sound of in the music itself. And while those pieces are very important and notable even for chamber choir, I want to draw special attention to a piece that I see I didn't put on the slide itself, though I know you're all seeing the iTunes right now. But it's called "O Praise the Lord of Heaven." It's almost never performed, to my understanding. He writes in the introduction that it was intended for a choir of some hundreds of voices. It was written for the Association of Church Choirs. It's written for triple choir, a smaller semi-chorus, and 2 other large choirs. Here is that you'll be able to hear as one group starts and another stops, goes back and forth. If you're familiar with some of Vaughan Williams' later choral works, you might have recognized a few fingerprints there. These some of the chords are what we call modal; they don't fit within a traditional scale, and these very kind of presentational aspects back and forth. He interplays with unison lines and full choral lines. There's a fair bit of counterpoint where the works the lines interplay and move along with each other. He's starting to get a sense of his own voice in large scale, in unaccompanied sacred music. So that's his work for the church. Now let's look at the third of these categories that I mentioned, that are folk songs. Vaughan Williams actually came rather late to the notion of reworking folk songs into a concert version. The first one he arranged was 1906. It's called Down Among the Dead Men. In fact, he wrote it not even intending it for a chorus, but for a production of the play, The Pilgrim's Progress, which later he would write that opera on, as I mentioned. This is for men's chorus, tenors and basses only.
He's a handful, the king, and a lasting ease to faction and end to wealth increase. Come, let us drink it while we have breath, for there's no drinking after death. And he who will his health deny, down among the dead men, let him lie.
There's one verse for you. Yes, so it's a drinking song essentially. There's no drinking after death, they say, and it's very much in the older tradition of particularly German men's choruses that started to be especially prominent in the 1820s, 1830s. This tradition that Britain took as well. In fact, we'll see that quite a lot of Vaughan Williams's folk songs started out as versions for tenors and basses, and only later did he make versions that are now better known for mixed voices. The first piece of music that Vaughan Williams really used folk songs in a large sense was the Fantasia on Christmas Carols from 1912. It's a setting of several different settings. Of tunes that he or somebody else had collected. Vaughan Williams loved Christmas gatherings. He loved the parties and the loudness and the music that came with it all, and the food. Where he really starts to grasp the possibilities of a folk song is with a cycle called 5 English Folk Songs, which was published in 1914, or premiered in 1914. Is his most prominent group of folk song arrangements really from his whole life. I could give easily a full hour's talk just on that piece. Here is one called The Springtime of the Year. This particular text takes place in Scotland, and I always think you can hear that we're in Scotland by the sounds of it. So that itself was wordless. Later, when text comes in, we find that it's about an individual who is hearing across the mists of Scotland, hearing somebody singing to his love, and so there it is. We just heard it. But the smooth weaving of the humming sounds of the background, the use of a soloist, those are things that Vaughan Williams did quite a bit with his folk song settings. I'm going to switch back to the other thing, which also is a good time for the questioning of things about his earlier stuff. He was just figuring out his voice. I like the fact that, through the English folk songs, they're like that last one, Springtime of the Year, and Oh Praise the Lord of Heaven. He's figuring out how to be himself. And he was doing that in the orchestral stuff too, in the big works with chorus orchestra, like the Sea Symphony at the same time, and the orchestral, the London Symphony. And then the war was about to happen, and everything got turned upside down.
Gary, we do have one question. Can you say more about the choral arrangement of Lark Ascending? Who was the composer? Who was the arranger? And how do we find a recording of that?
Yeah. You mean you want to hear more about the piece that I said I wasn't going to talk about? How dare we? Yes, I deserved it by bringing it up. The Lark Ascending, Vaughan Williams' great piece for violin and orchestra. from which he started before the First War and ended after it. I have a score of it somewhere. I wonder if I can find it fast enough. Nope. It's not at the top of the stack. I thought it was in. It's not worth digging through. It's arranged by a fellow called Paul Drayton, Drayton. It's quite beautiful, and it has been recorded online with the choir Voces 8, VOCES number 8. So if you like The Lark Ascending, I strongly encourage you to go listen to it. And there's this fascinating trend in choral music right now. It started about 20 years ago, and it's really grown, of arranging purely instrumental works for unaccompanied chorus, whether they be orchestral pieces or songs or other things. And this is one of I think the better representations of that trend.
I don't think there are any others. Let me just scan here really quickly. Oh, what about the Seventh Symphony? Well, what about the Seventh Symphony?
What about it? It's possible that that's a question of, I talked about the sixth and then the eighth and the ninth.
The eighth, but you didn't mention the seventh.
I
Yeah.
did mention the seventh, but didn't call it the seventh. The Sinfonia Antarctica, which he made based on the film score to Scott of the Antarctic, that was his seventh symphony. So his first three symphonies and his seventh symphony weren't actually given numbers, but when he did give numbers to some of the symphonies, he took into account those that were unnumbered. It's just a curse for all musicologists. I think he was just knowing it would cause us grief. It's actually a choral work also. It's written for a women's chorus and a wordless soprano and full orchestra, a prominent role for the wind machine as a musical instrument. Stunning work, very stark, and I find it quite a gripping piece. I hope that answers the question somewhat. That was the seventh.
I see no other questions at the moment, Gary. So if you would like to proceed.
Let's zip in to the. Okay, that didn't move. That was supposed to move to. There we go. To the music from Between the Wars. I'm going to start with the folk songs here. In 1919 and 20, he wrote quite a few, I think it was about 20-ish, of Christmas carols in very simple arrangements, largely in unison voices with organ. Some of them were adapted from his early works. There were two, one, The Truth Sent from Above, and another one called On Christmas Night, that were adapted from the Fantasia on Christmas carols, for example. He also wrote a series of arrangements that are mostly like for solo voice with some choral backup singers for a volume called The Motherland Songbook to promote folk songs. But there were also straight up folk song arrangements like some of the others. He didn't limit himself to English folk songs like The Turtle Dove. He also included a couple of Scottish works. Here is his Loch Lomond, a tune which you may recognize even if you know nothing of Vaughan Williams. This one's just for you. I'm going to skip ahead a bit. And it continues with some more verses. I love that ending when the higher soprano split off into multiple parts, this halo. There's a texture there that's very interesting. We have the melody in mezzos and baritones in in octaves. Then there was the descant of the sopranos, an independent bass line, and it was hard to hear it, another independent contrapuntal line in the altos. So he's drawing attention to the melody in the middle of an expanded texture. It's a much more sophisticated compositional style than a lot of people give to folk songs, who will just put the tune in the top and then everybody else harmonizes it underneath. I'm not going to play for you another one. It's called John Dory that we're doing at the concert. We're doing both of those two, Loch Lomond and John Dory at the concert, so he's thinking of folk songs in a more sophisticated way, and a more he's applying elaborate compositional technique to these very simple tunes. That's not to denigrate the tunes by any means, just to say that they themselves function well and independently. Let's shift back. I'm getting good at this shifting back, aren't I? You don't have to put that in the chat if you disagree or agree. Those are the folk songs of the period. As you can see from this list here, he wrote quite a lot of music for the church during this period between the wars. And it was pretty steady outflow. The style could be rather varied. So I want to go through this list before I actually play examples. For example, Lord, Thou Hast Been Our Refuge harkens back a little to the O Praise of the Lord of Heaven, these chordal structures. The Mass in G minor was written for Westminster Cathedral, not Westminster Abbey. That's Anglican in London. Westminster Cathedral is the Catholic cathedral in London. That's not confusing at all, is it? The director of music at Westminster Cathedral was one of those who was really bringing about this revolution of interest in music by Tallis and Bird and Taverner and other Renaissance British composers. Vaughan Williams is sometimes attributed as writing the very first mass in this kind of neo-Renaissance style. That's strictly speaking not true. Herbert Howells gets that honor with his Mass in the Dorian mode, but the Mass in G minor is, I think, the first real masterpiece that was done in this. O Vos Omnes is in a similar vein, but it's kind of darker. Let's actually go to some listening for of those earlier interwar pieces. Here's a bit of Lord, Thou Hast Been Our Refuge. It's for double choir. Earlier we heard a piece that was for triple choir. This is just for double. One of them has this chant-like melody, and the other is more presentational with a hymn tune that you may recognize. I'm going to skip now to, I hope you can still hear me when I'm talking here. I'm going to skip now to near the end of the piece so you can hear where this gentleness goes. You ready? It'll be a bit louder. It pains me to stop it, but if you really want to hear how brilliant an ending that becomes, you can do that. So at that end, he brings in organ, he brings in a solo trumpet. It's quite a grand statement. Again, he's blending these ancient styles of chant-like stuff and a hymn, but in his own way. To that end, here is the opening of the Mass in G minor. It's rather soft opening, so you may need to turn up your volume briefly. And so on. I hope you can hear what a different sonority that is from some of these other earlier sacred works. He's thinking about music in a very archaic way. In fact, there's a recent biographer of his that says it's not so much a mass in G minor as a mass about G minor. He kind of moves around in different ways, it's different modes, and makes it his own. Here's just a brief hint of the beginning of the next movement, the Gloria. You can hear where he's going back into these double choirs. Remember these big sonorous chords that are still quiet, but they're very full. And if you want to hear more of the Mass in G minor, you can come to our concert with the Emerald Ensemble next month. We're going to be performing it one on a part, which is unusual. It's written originally for a solo quartet and 2 choirs. So we're going to have a total of 12 singers. It is either gutsy or foolhardy, and you can find out with us how well that experiment may work. He continued, though, to write not only these big works for professional or quasi-professional choruses for sacred, but he also wrote for parish choirs or large or simpler organizations. In 1925, he wrote some of his first Anglican service music, a Magnificat and Nunc Dimittis that's called the Village Service. And it's mostly in unison, and it's very straightforward, simple stuff. Any parish choir would be able to handle it. And at the same time, he was writing more of these hymn tunes for songs of praise, just like the English hymnal from 1906. And 1928, still in the late 20s here, he was a co-editor of the Oxford Book of Carols, a volume of Christmas carols intended as much for concert performance as for any liturgical approach. But again, they're very straightforward, very easily approachable. Here's one of them called Wither's Rocking Hymn. You may have noticed some kind of harmonic oddities there, chords that didn't quite go where you wanted to, or where you wanted them to, or expected them to, or a melody that went to an odd pitch that was still beautiful. This is part of this modal composition, and I love the way that he was able to take this harmonic element that he had really explored in the Mass in G minor, and now he was putting it in for much simpler, more straightforward pieces, for little parish choirs or little village choirs or church choirs or town choirs, however it may be. His own language, but written for other people, for anybody he was to perform. There were other also big pieces. He wrote a big Te Deum in 28. He wrote another big Te Deum in 37 for the coronation of George VI. Those are both two big pieces with loud organ parts. I mentioned the Leith Hill Festival where he conducted the Bach St. Matthew Passion for many years. 1930 was an anniversary year, and he wrote several pieces for them, including 3 choral hymns. Usually they're done with orchestra. They also work very well with organ. And he wrote more service music in 1939 for the morning Anglican service and the communion Anglican service and the evening Anglican service, the whole of everything. Straightforward things, again, intended to be sung by any choir in the land. He was a very egalitarian fellow. There we have it for a bit of his sacred music. If you're interested in this, I especially recommend to you those 2 Te Deum settings, which are quite something. And they're not done very often, sadly. I have yet to talk about literary stuff between the wars, and there's actually very little to say. He kind of ignored literary texts for the most part in the period between the wars. But as you saw, he did quite a lot of folk song and quite a lot of sacred music. One notable exception was a setting of Milton called Nothing Is Here for Tears. It's a unison song written for orchestra in commemoration of the death of King George V. Coronations and royal occasions of all sorts always bring out some fantastic music. That's his middle period. Next, the late stuff where he really gets wild, unless we have questions, which we can certainly tend to.
Not so much questions as folks having comments. The story behind Loch Lomond is interesting. The mythology behind, I suppose. And one of your, I believe it's one of your Vashon folks that remarked, and I can't remember what piece this was in reference to, as being pre-Honegger-esque. I thought that would get a reaction from you. So I thought I would just share that a little bit.
I would say the Lord, Thou Hast Been Our Refuge. And it's a reference certainly to Honegger's Christmas cantata. We've done both of those pieces with the Vashon Island Chorale, which I conduct. And it's true. It's interesting. I wouldn't say that Honegger was influenced by it, but rather that the two of them were influenced by the same sources. How very Darwinian of musical composition. The idea of bringing in chant and chordal stuff, but also some occasional dissonances to keep it from being to keep it engaging and have a greater variety of emotional fluidity throughout it.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. Excellent. Seeing no other, I will just quickly make sure that there are no other remarks in the Q&A to follow. No, I don't believe there are. Let me scroll up. No, I don't think we have any others, Gary, if you'd like to proceed.
Yeah, sure. I'm intrigued now. I'm thinking more about, I wonder if Vaughan Williams and Honegger knew each other. I do not have that information. So that's
an interesting idea.
I mean, they certainly were kindred souls in terms of their compositions. In many ways. So we move to the late works, and I'm going to start with the literary stuff this time. Here is a bit of a cycle he wrote, and I'm going to jump right in the sound, called 6 Choral Songs to be sung in time of war. This was written during the Second World War, and this performance is with orchestra, but it also is written for piano or orchestra. It has the swagger of patriotism, and Vaughan Williams was very patriotic, but it doesn't have the kind of the bombacity, that one, that word. And their festival pieces, the scores are impossible to come by, but I love this little cycle of 6 unison songs intended to be sung in time of war, as he says. And it still has some of those there we go. It still has these modal colors to it, but it's more sturdy, and the melody itself is a little more predictable to depict its patriotic elements. By this point in Vaughan Williams' life, he had been working on this opera on the Pilgrim's Progress for decades, and at different times in his life, he gave up on the idea that he'd ever finish it. Certainly during the war was one of those. And so 2 pieces were inspired by the Pilgrim's Progress. One is called Valiant for Truth, and the other, The New Commonwealth, with music that eventually made its way into the opera, which he did finish after the war. They're wonderful pieces. In addition to the poetry of Bunyan and his Pilgrim's Progress, another poet who inspired Vaughan Williams greatly was Ursula Wood, who later would become Ursula Vaughan Williams, as I mentioned earlier. They together wrote a series, or a large cycle with, of chorus and orchestra, called The Sons of Light, from which they excerpted 4 numbers and called it Sun, Moon, Stars, and Man, for unison choir and piano. Notice there's a lot of unison stuff and also a lot of big triple choir or double choir stuff, and everything in the middle. That's Vaughan Williams writing for any different source, any different folks he can. Ursula also wrote a piece called Silence and Music, which wrote the text to Silence and Music, which Vaughan Williams added to a collection of madrigals written in honor of the newly crowned Queen Elizabeth II. It's a gorgeous little piece. I understand this weekend, Seattle Choir Opus 7 is performing it. So if you happen to be Seattle and you're considering coming to the Emerald Ensemble concert next month, consider also going to Opus 7 this weekend. It's going to be a fantastic show. You get to hear Silence and Music. The crowning achievement for Vaughan Williams in his literary settings for chamber chorus is the 3 Shakespeare songs. They're among his most often performed works, but they're also rather challenging. There was a conductor named Cecil Armstrong Gibbs who asked Vaughan Williams to write work for as a kind of test piece for a competition, an informal choral competition. Vaughan Williams declined, and saying, no, it's better that they do something that's more established in the repertoire. And then Adeline, Vaughan Williams' wife, died, and he sent to Cecil Armstrong Gibbs these 3 Shakespeare settings, saying, do with these as you wish. And I'm convinced that there is a connection between Adeline's death and these pieces, which were written within, I want to say, 3 or 4 weeks after. The first 2 deal with the idea of death itself. Here is the second one, called The Cloud-Capped Towers. And I'll pause there. I'm trying only to do these things that last no more than a minute so that we're sure that they're in the fair use. Apologies to copyright holders for that one, which I meant 3 minutes, 3 seconds over with. You'll notice that there these big open chords, but still soft chords, like we encountered earlier in the Mass and to a certain extent in Lord Thou hast been our refuge. But the harmonies are much more, they're much richer. They have these modal sonorities to them that just kind of go in odd ways. But that wonderful full sound for the three Shakespeare songs is quite something. The last segment of it uses the same chord progression as the end of Vaughan Williams' Sixth Symphony. This very bleak, some said it was about post-apocalyptic reality, which was not, he disavowed any notion of that. But it talks about that life is rounded with a sleep. Just gorgeous stuff. Three Shakespeare songs. In fact, the very first earliest works of Vaughan Williams for chamber choir that survive to us are three Elizabethan songs, two of which are Shakespeare, and he kind of rounds out his career with this set, some of the best writing for Shakespeare. Next. So there's his literary close. Folk songs he continued writing with, though with less vigor as between the wars. For example, there was a group of 9 carols for men's chorus, very simple, very straightforward stuff. And then in the 1950s, he finally gave a women's chorus masterwork for based on folk songs. It's called The Folk Songs of the Four Seasons. Very rarely done. He incorporates, I think it's 12 or 13 different folk songs into the cycles, half an hour long or so. Written for orchestra or for piano, and it's a magnificent piece. I'm not going to play anything because it doesn't excerpt well. It doesn't have many showy things, but it's just wonderful tunes throughout, and well worth your time if you wish to explore further. We'll close with music for the church. 2 big works, The Souls of the Righteous and The Voice Out of the Whirlwind. That was actually an adaptation he made from his ballet, Job, and he chose text from the book of Job, the biblical book of Job, to go into that. It's amazing. But let's hear, though, an incredibly unusual piece. It does not sound like Vaughan Williams to me, and we're doing this in the concert next month, and I've really fallen in love with this odd piece called Prayer to the Father of Heaven. It was written, is dedicated to Hubert Parry, who he says in the dedication that he hopes that this piece would have something characteristic about it, which was Hubert Parry's own phrase, to come up with something that is your own, very appropriate for Vaughan Williams' philosophy. Here is Prayer to the Father of Heaven. There are aspects of this piece that I feel are perhaps more likely to be found in the music of Eric Whitacre than in Vaughan Williams, and that's quite a compliment to Whitacre, I might add. These odd harmonies, like we also heard in the Cloud-Capped Towers. After the war, Vaughan Williams was thinking about new sonorities, new harmonies, new instruments, new to him at least, and really opening his ears to that. There was prayer to the Father of Heaven. In 1953, for the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, he contributed 2 works. One is a very short piece called O Taste and See, that it's about 1 minute and 10 seconds long, that was written for the moment when Queen Elizabeth takes communion for the first time as queen. The other piece he wrote was called The Old 100th Psalm Tune. Glorious, big, huge orchestra, brass, organ, or just organ also, which is why it belongs in this category of a chamber choir. It was the first time in a coronation that involved congregational singing. They asked Vaughan Williams to write a piece, and he said, okay, on one condition. He wanted to make the congregation of royals and nobles and foreign dignitaries sing. And they did. It worked. The 1954 work Hodie with orchestra is about 1 hour long. I mentioned that has many wonderful excerpts worth bringing up in this point, but I want to close with the strangest work that Vaughan Williams wrote in any genre whatsoever. And I'm not just saying that. I mentioned a biographer, which I'll show you the book later. A recent biographer agrees with me on this. This is called A Vision of Aeroplanes. The text is from the book of Isaiah. It's with organ. I'll play the little intro, and then I'm going to skip a bit into some choral stuff. Isn't the here, I forgot to hit the pause first. Isn't that just really weird? It's so dissonant, so dramatic. The text is about there was a whirlwind of heaven, and to really get that sense of the whirlwind in the organ writing and in the harmonies that he's chosen. New sonorities, new ideas, as Vaughan Williams was getting into his 80s. Very few composers who arrive into their 70s and 80s rethink of music in such a way as they did. Haydn is the other example that comes readily to mind. More kudos to Vaughan Williams for taking that and for still finding his own voice. A Vision of Aeroplanes, that's been near the top of my bucket list for a while. Hard to manage it though. As I mentioned, this is a golden age for Vaughan Williams for his choral music, as new pieces are being not necessarily discovered, but they're being published, recorded, performed for the first times. I invite you to explore online. These slides will be available, and you can use those as your guide if you're so inclined. Also, I've created a table that it will be on the website at emeraldensemble.org that lists all of his music for chamber choir grouped into these 3 categories I gave it, and by year, so you can compare it to the other large-scale works. I draw your attention to that also because if you're interested in getting to know Vaughan Williams' music beyond choral music or chamber choir, then those are the pieces to undertake. I put a little indicator there of what is for orchestra, what's chamber music, what's film music, so you can pick and choose your favorites. But this is the 150th anniversary year of Vaughan Williams, and what better opportunity to explore this composer in a way that perhaps you haven't before. Our concert is next month, Saturday, November 12th. Info is at emeraldensemble.org. I wanted to commend to you, in addition to the recordings of Dutton and Albion, those 2 labels, wonderful new biography by one Eric Saylor called Vaughan Williams, just came out this year, and it has quickly become one of my favorite biographies of any composer. I think he did a fantastic job of it. You really get a sense of the character of the man and of his music. And with that, do we have any more questions?
Yeah, we had one other that seems close to where are we at here? And now I've lost it. Oh, how many compositions did he write?
Oh my word, what a great question. Many hundreds. I was going through the complete works list at the back of this, and there are hundreds of works, especially if you consider each little part song or each song or each folk song setting, of which there are dozens upon dozens of those. If you consider them as separate works, which is essentially how they originated, they're quite a great many. There has not been a catalog of his works like for Beethoven or Mozart or Schubert that puts them all in numeric order. Maybe I should do that or something. And the hymn tunes alone, if you count his hymn harmonizations, that's 130, 140-ish just there. They're simple compositions, but they still count as big works. Yeah.
Yeah, and Stu commented back, the Boeing 707 was produced in 1956. Is that a coincidence? Yeah,
For the vision of aeroplanes.
yeah, yeah, yeah.
If so, I hope that a flight on that plane is less dramatic an occasion than the piece of music is.
Right, right. Well, Gary, seeing no other questions, I want to thank you for your usual uh, scholarship and a very informative presentation again. It's always a pleasure to peer into your musicological mind, and I get to do that all the time, and I'm very glad that through Emerald Choral Academy we get to do that with our friends and fans as well. And thank you to all of you for all your questions and your contributions to today's discussion. Don't forget, if you haven't made a donation yet, you still can at emeraldensemble.org. The next offering of the Emerald Choral Academy will take place on Wednesday, November 9th, when Emerald Choral Academy faculty member and familiar performer Ryan Beatty will be offering Vocal Anatomy 105, The Articulators. Ryan will be returning after the previous four sessions that he's given. The most recent was on the resonators. And so now we move on to the articulators, taking us continually higher in the anatomy seems to be or more progressive in the anatomy seems to be the path. Don't forget to purchase your tickets for our upcoming concert, O Radiant Luminary, celebrating 150 years of Ray Vaughan Williams, which is on November 12th at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in Laurelhurst, our traditional venue and our first public concert since February of 2020. Tickets and information are available at emeraldensemble.org. We at the Emerald Ensemble are grateful for the enthusiasm of each of you, our audience and supporters. As the Emerald Choral Academy continues, you can help to support all of our efforts by donating at emeraldensemble.org. You can let us know also of topics that you would like to see discussed in the future. In the meantime, I'm Scott Kovacs, and on behalf of Gary and all the Emerald Ensemble, I wish you good physical and mental health. Thank you.